I love you even though you're not here to stay. I love you with everything I have.
There is a kind of love that no one warns you about. Not the love that arrives with intention, the kind you dress for, the kind that has a beginning you can point to, a moment you can name, but the love that comes in through the back door of grief, quiet and uninvited, while you are busy surviving something else entirely. The kind that does not ask your permission, the kind that simply takes up residence in the space that is left open, and by the time you notice it is there, it has already learned the shape of every room. Saoirse Calloway did not go to Ashveil Manor to fall in love. She went because her body had not been told yet. She had carried her daughter for 9 months, had felt her turn in the night. Those slow, private movements that exist only between a woman and the life she is making, that belong to no one else, that cannot be described to anyone who has not felt them. She had pressed her palm to the rise of her belly in the dark, and believed, with the fierce and foolish certainty of a woman who has nothing else left to believe in, that this child would be the answer. To the abandonment, to the silence, to every question she had been too proud to ask out loud. Was I worth staying for? Does it matter in the end that I existed? Her daughter lived for 9 minutes. Saoirse counted everyone. And then the cruelest thing happened. The thing no one prepares you for. The thing that has no funeral, no black dress, no neighbors arriving with food and lowered voices. Her body did not know. On the second day the milk came in, warm, persistent, indifferent to grief, like a tide that answers only to biology and time. She pressed her hands against herself in the dark and felt the warmth of it, and something inside her broke in a place she did not have language for. Not her heart, deeper than that. The part of her that had believed, without evidence and against all reason, that the universe was paying attention. It was not. 200 miles north, in a manor house that smelled of cold stone and fresh grief, and candles burning in rooms no one was using, a different kind of loss was moving through the walls like weather. The Earl of Ashveil had a son. The Earl of Ashveil no longer had a wife. And the child, small, furious, impossibly alive, screamed through the hours while a household full of trained servants stood at a helpless distance, and a man who had never once in his life been undone by anything sat beside a crib in the dark, with his jaw set and his hands shaking, and his entire formidable will directed at a single, desperate task. Keep watching. As long as you keep watching, he keeps breathing. Caelan Morth, Earl of Ashveil, had commanded men in battle. He had negotiated things that mattered. He had buried his father at 22 and stepped into a title so heavy it had taken him years to learn to carry without flinching. He was not, by any reasonable measure, a man who came apart. And yet, every time he looked at his son, this small, red, catastrophically alive creature who had cost his wife everything and seemed entirely unaware of what he had done, Caelan felt something move through him that had no name in any language he had ever learned. Not grief exactly, not love exactly. Something that lived between them, in the dark, like a bird caught in a chimney, panicked, directionless, making it very difficult to breathe. 2 people, 2 losses, 1 child flickering between them like a candle in a draught. This is the story of what happened when she walked through his door, and what he heard standing in hers. If you are new here, welcome. This is what we do. Stories about people broken in ways the world doesn't hold funerals for, finding each other in the only place that was ever going to work. The exact wreckage of everything that came before. Settle in. Close your eyes if you'd like. And let me tell you about Saoirse Calloway and the Earl who did not know she was already saving him, long before he ever heard what she said to his son in the dark. And the chair had become a kind of sentence. Saoirse had not left it in 5 days, not because she lacked the strength, but because every time she considered standing, the room reminded her of what standing meant. The kettle needed filling. The grate needed laying. The world, relentlessly and without apology, required participation, and she had none to give. So she sat. She kept her hands in her lap. She watched the light move across the floor in the slow, indifferent way that light moves when it has no idea what has happened in a room. The cradle was still in the corner. She had not moved it. She could not explain why, except that moving it felt like a declaration she wasn't ready to make. It was lined with soft flannel she had saved 3 months to buy. Pale yellow, because she had not known, and had wanted something warm. It sat in the corner now like a question she had stopped being able to answer, and she looked at it the way you look at something that might shatter you if you look directly. So you keep it just at the edge of your vision, and you manage. The letter arrived on a Thursday. She recognized the midwife's hand before she opened it. Mrs. Breda, who had held her through 8 hours of labor, and been the one to tell her, with a steadiness Saoirse had clung to like a rope, what had happened. She almost didn't open it. Then she did. It was short. Mrs. Breda did not believe in softening things that needed to be said plainly. There is a boy at Ashveil Manor, 5 weeks old. His mother did not survive the birth. He has refused 3 wet nurses and is losing weight. The Earl is at his limit. I told him I knew someone. Come, if you can come soon. Saoirse read it twice. Then she looked at the cradle. She sat with the question for a long time, whether going was survival or betrayal, whether offering this body, this milk that had come in for a child who would never drink it, to a stranger's son, was a mercy or a kind of forgetting she had no right to. She turned it over. She examined it from every angle she had, and in the end she decided that she could not afford the distinction. She was 23 years old. She had no money, no husband, and no future in this room that was only a room and had never been anything else. She had a body that was still performing the work of motherhood for a child who was gone. And she had, beneath the grief, a stubbornness she had not chosen and could not surrender. The kind that does not come from strength, but from the simple refusal to let the worst thing that ever happened to you be the last word. She packed in the dark. 1 bag, only what was practical. The coach north smelled of old leather and other people's exhaustion. She pressed her forehead to the cold glass and watched England dissolve into the dark, and told herself quietly, firmly, like a woman talking herself back from a ledge, this is not hope. This is just the next thing. She almost believed it. She did not wait for morning. The housekeeper, a tall woman named Mrs. Patch, who had the expression of someone who had weathered considerable things and expected to weather more, had shown her to a small room on the east corridor and told her the Earl would receive her at 8. And Saoirse nodded, set her bag down, and listened. Because beneath the settling of the old house, beneath the wind at the window and the tick of a clock somewhere down the hall, there was a sound. Not loud, but persistent. The specific, fraying cry of a child who has been asking for something for a very long time and has begun to lose faith that it is coming. She followed it without deciding to. The nursery was lit by a single candle on the table by the window, and in its light she saw him, and understood immediately why 3 women had already left. Not because of the man, because of what the man was doing to himself. Caelan Moratha was dark-haired, broad-shouldered, dressed as though he had begun the day with full intention and lost it somewhere around midnight. His cravat was gone, while his jaw was set in the precise way of someone who has decided that if he simply holds the situation firmly enough, it will eventually comply. He was holding the baby the way you hold something you are terrified of dropping. Every muscle engaged, total concentration, zero instinct. And the baby was screaming anyway, indifferent to the effort. He looked up when she entered. His eyes were gray and exhausted in a way that sleep would not fix. She did not introduce herself. There wasn't time. She crossed the room and held out her arms. He hesitated. She could see it move across his face. The calculation, the propriety, the very reasonable strangeness of surrendering your infant son to a woman you had known for approximately 40 seconds. She understood it. She did not have patience for it. "My lord," she said quietly, "he's hungry. Everything else can wait." Something in him resolved. He placed the baby in her arms with a carefulness so deliberate it was almost painful to watch. The extreme, effortful gentleness of a man who is terrified of doing it wrong. And then Finn, small and furious and warm, turned toward her with the blind, absolute certainty of a body that knows before the mind does. And the crying stopped. Not all at once. It faded like a storm passing, from fury to hiccups to silence. And his whole body softened against her, degree by degree, the way a fist slowly opened. She did not look at the Earl. The Earl did not look away. He stayed far longer than he needed to, standing in the corner of the room saying nothing, and she was aware of him, the way you are aware of the only candle in a dark space, not looking directly, but always knowing exactly where it is. When he finally left, the door closed so softly she barely heard it. She sat in the candlelight with a child who was not hers and felt the warmth of him. Specific, unbearable, familiar in a way that cracked something open she had been holding shut for 5 days. She pressed her lips to the top of his head and breathed. She told herself to be careful. She was already failing. Finn woke at 5 with the reliability of a church bell and considerably more volume. Saoirse learned this on the first morning. Learned it before she was fully awake, her body already moving down the dark corridor on instinct, pulled by a sound that her sleeping mind had somehow filed under yours without asking her permission. She was halfway to the nursery before she understood she was standing up. She did not expect to find the Earl in the corridor. She found him every morning, always dressed. That was the first thing she noticed, and it unsettled her in a way she couldn't immediately name, because it meant one of 2 things, and neither of them was simple. Either he had not slept, or he had risen in the black hours before dawn and dressed himself with the same formality he brought to every other part of the day, as though grief was not sufficient reason to loosen a collar. She suspected, watching him in those dim corridor mornings, that it was both. The first morning they only looked at each other. No greeting, no explanation. She went into the nursery, and he stood in the doorway for a moment, and then he was gone. And she did not examine what it meant that he had been there at all. The second morning he followed her in. He stood in the corner the way he always stood, contained, quiet, taking up space without imposing it. And he watched her work with the expression of a man who is learning something by observation because he does not know how to ask to be taught. She did not explain herself. He did not ask her to. When Finn was settled and the room had gone quiet, he left without ceremony, the way a man leaves a space he wasn't certain he was permitted to enter. She thought about that on the walk back to her room. The uncertainty of him, the carefulness. She had expected a cold. She had expected the particular distant authority of men who wore titles the way other men wore armor. She had not expected someone who stood in corners and watched his son sleep with the focused attention of a person committing something to memory. The third morning, she was the one who stopped in the doorway. He was already there. Standing over the crib, not touching, just looking at Finn with an expression so carefully composed, it told her everything about what was underneath it. The most controlled faces, she had learned, always had the most happening behind them. She stayed very still. Then Finn made a sound. Not crying, something else, something small and exploratory, the sound of a person discovering that their voice exists. And she watched it happen. Watched something move across Kaylin's face that was private and unguarded, and had nothing to do with her, and was entirely not meant to be seen. She stepped back into the corridor. She gave him the minute. She stood in the dark with her back against the cold wall and understood, while with the quiet precision of a woman who has always known when something is going to cost her, that she had already begun to love him for exactly that. For the way he looked at his son when he thought no one was watching. For the care he took with things he didn't know how to say out loud. She knew what it meant. She knew what it was going to cost. She stood in the corridor a moment longer, and then she went back in, loudly enough that he would hear her coming. It seemed like a decent thing to do. It was also, she knew, already too late. It was past midnight when she ran out of ordinary things to say. Finn had been restless all evening, not hungry, not in pain, simply unsettled in the way small creatures are when the world feels uncertain, and they lack the language to explain it. She had fed him, walked him. He sung the 3 songs she knew and invented 2 more. She had told him about the sparrows that nested in the eave outside her childhood window, about the smell of the sea at low tide, which she had only encountered once but had never forgotten, about the bakery on the high street in the village where she grew up, and the way the smell of it on a cold morning could convince you, briefly and completely, that everything was going to be fine. Finn had listened with the grave, unfocused attention of someone taking notes. Now the house was completely still. The candle on the table had burned low, throwing the room in soft, unsteady gold. Finn was nearly asleep, his weight against her chest gone heavy and loose, his breathing beginning to slow into the long, even rhythm that meant the restlessness had finally tired itself out. She should have put him down. She didn't. She stood by the window in the dying candlelight and held him and listened to the silence. And it was the silence that did it. That particular quality of stillness that exists only after midnight, when the guard drops, because there is no performance left to give, and no audience left to give it to. She heard herself speak before she decided to, quietly, to the top of his head, where his hair was fine and warm and smelled of clean linen. "I love your father." The words landed in the room like something that had been waiting a long time to be set down. She didn't stop. She couldn't, now. "I have loved him since the third morning, when I stood in the doorway and saw him holding you like you were the most important thing he had ever been trusted with. He didn't know I was there." She pressed her lips to Finn's hair and kept her voice very low, the way you keep a voice when you are finally telling the truth, and the truth is too large for ordinary volume. "I love the way he forgets to be an Earl in the library. I love that he left a bookmark on his desk without a word, and never once made anything of it. I love that he comes to the corridor every morning even though he doesn't have to, and neither of us pretends to know why." Finn's breathing deepened. She closed her eyes briefly. "And I am going to leave," she whispered, "before he has to ask me to, because that is the only way I know how to love something, quietly, from a direction it will never see coming." The candle guttered. She looked up. Kaelin was in the doorway. Dark coat, no cravat, a hair disordered in the particular way of a man who has been awake for hours without intending to be. The private version of him, the one that only the 5 o'clock corridor ever saw. He was very still. He had been there long enough. She knew it the moment she saw his face. Not shock. Something past shock. Something that lived on the other side of it. The expression of a man who has just heard the truest thing anyone has ever said about him and does not yet know if he is permitted to answer. Neither of them moved. The candle did not go out. 5 seconds. 10. The silence between them was not empty. It was the fullest silence she had ever stood inside, weighted with everything that had accumulated in corridors and libraries and corners of a nursery over weeks of carefully not saying. "Saoirse," he said. Just her name. Nothing else. But the way he said it, like a word he had been learning to pronounce correctly for a very long time, and had only, in this moment, finally got right, moved through her like the first warmth after a long cold, and undid her, completely and without mercy, from the inside out. Lady Ivelisse Moort arrived on a Thursday with 2 trunks and the calm, unhurried energy of a woman who has never once in her life doubted that she was the solution to whatever problem she was walking toward. She was not unkind. That was the thing that made it so difficult. She found Saoirse in the garden and said what needed to be said with the quiet precision of a woman who has never required cruelty, because accuracy has always been sufficient. The world would talk. It was already beginning to. Finn would grow into a boy, and then a man, and the story of his earliest months would follow him into every room he inherited, and the shape of that story depended entirely on the choices made now, while he was still too small to understand what was being decided on his behalf. Saoirse was not a bad person. Lady Ivelisse wanted to be clear about that. She was, in fact, precisely the wrong kind of person, the kind that mattered, the kind that left a mark, the kind that a child called for at 5 in the morning, and a man stood in corridors without quite admitting why. That was exactly the problem. Saoirse already knew all of it. She had known it for weeks, had been carrying it the way you carry something sharp. very carefully, with constant awareness of where it was, making sure it didn't cut anyone else. She thanked Lady Evelise. She meant it. Then she went to find Caelan, and she found him in the library. Of course she did. He was standing at the window with the expression of a man who had already heard the carriage arrive and had been waiting with dread and precision for this exact conversation. She told him she was leaving. He said her name once, the way he had said it in the nursery doorway, as though it were something he had only recently learned to carry correctly. She made herself keep going. She told him it was the right thing, the only thing, the thing that protected Finn and protected him, and gave her back the small, manageable life she could actually afford to live. He asked her not to go, and she asked him, quietly, steadily, the way you ask a question you already know will break something. "How would you ask me to stay, Caelan?" "What?" The silence that followed was the longest of her life. She watched him. She watched him search for an answer that was true and good and sufficient, watched him turn it over the way you turn over something you hoped would hold weight and are discovering, slowly, that it won't. She watched him fail, and she loved him for trying, and it did not make a single thing easier. She picked up her bag. She walked out without looking back, because she knew, with the complete, exhausted certainty of a woman who understands exactly what she is capable of, that if she saw his face, she would stay. And staying without an answer was worse than leaving with one. Her resolution was the only thing she had left. She held it with both hands all the way to her father's house, and did not let go. She was gone for 9 days. She spent them slowly, methodically, rebuilding the version of herself that did not stand in candlelit nurseries confessing things to sleeping infants. She slept. She helped with the garden. She told herself, with increasing conviction and decreasing success, that she had made the right choice, the sensible choice, the choice that protected everyone, including herself. She had not finished convincing herself on the 9th morning when she heard the horse. He looked terrible. That was the first thing she registered before she had fully understood it, was him. The road dust, the disordered hair, the particular hollowness of a man who has been losing a long argument with himself and has finally, at considerable cost, surrendered. He dismounted before the horse had fully stopped. He walked toward her with the stride of someone who has made a decision and is not going to allow himself the time to unmake it. He did not make promises. She would remember that afterward, that he had understood, without being told, that promises were not what she needed. What she needed was evidence. What she needed was the present tense. So he gave her that. He told her he had walked an empty corridor for 9 mornings, that the east wing at 5 o'clock was just a corridor now, and corridors were not supposed to feel like absences, but this one did. He told her he had sat in the nursery the previous night, and Finn had said her name into the dark at the 5 o'clock hour, said it with the calm certainty of someone announcing an expected arrival. And the sound of it had moved through him like a key turning in a lock he hadn't known was closed. He told her that he, Caelan Morth, Earl of Ashveil, a man who had commanded soldiers and negotiated treaties and carried a title that had taken years to learn to walk under without flinching, had stood in a dark corridor listening to his 4-month-old son call for a woman who was not there, and understood with complete and devastating clarity that his silence, when she had asked him the only question that mattered, had not been caution. It had been cowardice, and he was finished with it. "I heard you," he said. His voice was low and even, the voice of a man choosing precision over protection, perhaps for the first time in his life. "What you said to him that night. Every word." She went very still. "I know," he said. I rode here to tell you that you were wrong about one thing." He reached out and took her hands, both of them, with the same careful, deliberate grip she had first seen him use the night he placed his son in her arms. The grip of a man who understands exactly what he is holding. "You said you were going to leave before I could see it coming." His eyes held hers. "I saw it coming from the third morning in the corridor. I have been standing in every doorway since, hoping you would say it out loud." She looked at him for a long time, long enough to be certain, long enough to feel the difference between a sentence and a truth. Then she stepped forward. He met her halfway, and somewhere north of them, in a warm nursery at Ashveil Manor, Finn slept, small, certain, and entirely unaware that he had just become the most consequential matchmaker in the history of the English countryside. He would be told the story eventually, when he was old enough to find it funny rather than bewildering. He would hear about the corridor and the candle and the confession and the 9 days and the horse. He would hear about the woman who loved his father quietly and from a direction she thought he'd never see coming. And he would hear how wrong she was. If this story found you, if Saoirse's confession in that candlelit nursery made you hold your breath, or Caelin's ride through 9 days of silence made you finally exhale, then you already know what this channel is. This is what we do here. Stories about people broken in ways the world doesn't hold funerals for, who find each other anyway, in the small hours, in the corridors, in the spaces between what is proper and what is true. If you're new here, subscribe now and turn on notifications, because I promise you will not want to miss what comes next. And if this story moved you, if it sat in your chest the way the best ones do, please share it with someone who needs it tonight. Sometimes that is all it takes. A story, the right one, at the right time. Thank you for being here. Take care of yourselves. Take care of each other. I'll see you in the next one.